What happens when one of country music's biggest stars walks into the lion's den of daytime television and refuses to back down? When Blake Shelton agreed to appear on The View, nobody expected the conversation to spiral into one of the most explosive confrontations in daytime TV history. What started as a routine promotional interview quickly became a battle of wills that would leave studio audiences gasping, producers scrambling, and social media absolutely erupting. This wasn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This was a full-scale verbal warfare that ended with security being called and one of the most shocking exits in television history. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think really happened. Now, let's get into the chaos that unfolded when Blake Shelton sat down with Whoopi Goldberg and the rest of the View panel. The morning started like any other at the View studios in New York City. Blake Shelton had arrived to promote his latest album and upcoming tour dates. Expecting the usual questions about his music career and life in Oklahoma, the country superstar looked relaxed in his signature cowboy hat and boots, settling into the guest chair with that familiar, easygoing smile that had charmed audiences for decades. "Welcome back to The View, Blake," Whoopi said as the show returned from commercial break. "Great to have you here again." "Thanks for having me, Whoopi." "Always a pleasure to be here with you ladies," Blake replied, his Oklahoma drawl thick as molasses. The conversation began innocently enough. Joy Behar asked about his new album, and Blake launched into his standard promotional spiel about working with talented songwriters and connecting with his fans. Sarah N. chimed in with questions about his tour schedule, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Then Whoopi decided to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Blake, you've been pretty vocal about your political views on social media lately," Whoopi said, her tone shifting slightly. "Some of your fans have been upset about your recent posts. Do you think celebrities should keep their political opinions to themselves?" Blake's smile faltered for just a moment. "Well, Whoopi, I think everyone has a right to their opinion, whether they're famous or not. I'm an American citizen, and I believe in speaking my mind. But don't you think you have a responsibility to your fans who might disagree with you?" Sunny Holston interjected. "Country music has fans across the political spectrum." Blake leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening slightly. "I respect my fans, but I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not just to sell records. If people don't like what I have to say, they don't have to listen." The tension in the studio was starting to build. Whoopi exchanged glances with her co-hosts before pressing forward. "It's interesting that you say that, Blake, because some of your recent comments have been pretty controversial. You seem to suggest that certain policies were, quote, destroying traditional American values. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?" Blake's demeanor shifted completely, his relaxed posture straightened, and his voice took on a harder edge. "I meant exactly what I said, Whoopi. I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma where people still believe in hard work, family values, and taking care of your neighbors. Those aren't controversial ideas. They're common sense. But whose definition of family values are we talking about will be shot back, because for many Americans, family values include acceptance and equality for all families, regardless of who they love or how they're structured." "I never said anything about not accepting people," Blake replied, his voice rising slightly. "But I also don't think we should be rewriting history or pretending that traditional families haven't been the backbone of this country for generations." Joy Behar jumped in, sensing the rising tension. "Blake, I think what Whoopi is trying to say is that your comments might come across as exclusionary to some people." Blake turned to face Joy directly. "With all due respect, Joy, I don't think I need you to interpret what I meant. I'm perfectly capable of speaking for myself." The studio audience had gone completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something was about to explode. Whoopi leaned forward, her voice getting stronger. "Blake, you're sitting at this table as a guest, and we're having a conversation. If you can't handle having your views challenged, maybe you shouldn't be sharing them so publicly." "Oh, I can handle it just fine," Blake said, his Oklahoma accent getting thicker with anger. "But I don't appreciate being lectured by people who live in a completely different world than the folks I represent." "Different world," Whoopi's eyebrows shot up. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Blake gestured around the studio. "I mean this Whoopi, this bubble you all live in here in New York City. You sit around this table every day talking about how the rest of America should think and feel, but you have no idea what life is really like for regular people." The other co-hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was clearly not going according to anyone's plan. "Regular people?" Whoopi's voice was getting louder now. Blake, I've been working since I was a child. I've lived in poverty. I've struggled. I've fought for everything I have. Don't you dare sit there and tell me I don't know what regular people go through. Blake stood up slightly in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. I'm not talking about your personal struggles, Whoopi. I'm talking about the fact that you and your colleagues here think you know what's best for everyone else. You sit in your ivory tower and judge people like me and my fans. Ivory tower. Whoopi was on her feet now, her voice booming across the studio. This is exactly the kind of divisive rhetoric that's tearing this country apart. You want to talk about knowing regular people? I connect with regular people every single day through this show. You connect with people who already agree with you. Blake shot back, also standing up. Anyone who disagrees gets shouted down or called names. That's not connecting. That's preaching to the choir. The producers were frantically signaling from behind the cameras, trying to get the situation under control. But both Whoopi and Blake were too fired up to notice. You know what, Blake? Whoopi said, pointing her finger at him. If you think this show is so terrible, and if you think we're so out of touch, then maybe you shouldn't have come here in the first place. Maybe I shouldn't have, Blake replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. But I thought I was coming here for an interview, not an interrogation. The studio had erupted into chaos. Audience members were murmuring loudly. Camera operators were looking confused, and the other co-hosts were trying desperately to restore order. Sarah N. attempted to jump in. Maybe we should all just take a step back. And no, Whoopi interrupted, her eyes never leaving Blake. I want to hear what Blake has to say since he thinks he knows so much about what's wrong with this show and what's wrong with people like me. Blake's face was red now, his hands clenched at his sides. You want to know what I think, Whoopi? I think you've forgotten where you came from. I think you've been sitting at this table so long, surrounded by people who tell you how brilliant you are that you've lost touch with reality. The gasps from the studio audience were audible. Even the camera operators had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. Whoopi stepped closer to Blake, her voice shaking with anger. Lost touch with reality. Blake, I wake up every morning and I see what's happening in this country. I see the hate, the division, the people who are being marginalized and attacked. And then I see people like you with your platforms spreading more division instead of trying to heal it. People like me. Blake's voice was incredulous. What exactly do you mean by people like me, Whoopi? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Whoopi's response. Whoopi's eyes narrowed as she processed Blake's challenge. The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. When she finally spoke, her voice was dangerously calm. You know exactly what I mean, Blake. People who have privilege and platforms and use them to punch down instead of lifting others up. People who wrap themselves in the flag and talk about traditional values while ignoring the pain and struggles of anyone who doesn't look like them or think like them. Blake's face went from red to purple. There it is, he said, shaking his head. I was wondering when you'd play that card. Anyone who disagrees with you must be a racist, right? That's your go-to move. I never said you were racist, Whoopi replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. You didn't have to say it, Blake shot back. It's written all over your face. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't just disagree with someone's politics. You have to attack their character. Joy Behar tried again to intervene. Blake, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. Nobody is attacking your character. Blake whipped around to face Joy. Really? Because it sure sounds like I'm being called a privileged bigot for having the audacity to disagree with the liberal orthodoxy. Liberal orthodoxy. Whoopi laughed bitterly. Blake, believing that all people deserve equal rights and dignity isn't liberal orthodoxy. It's basic human decency. And there you go again, Blake said, throwing his hands up in frustration. Putting words in my mouth. When did I ever say people don't deserve equal rights? When did I ever say anything about dignity? You didn't have to say it explicitly, Sunny. Host jumped in. But when you talk about traditional values and real Americans, there's an implication about who counts and who doesn't. Blake turned to Sunny, his anger now boiling over. An implication? So now you're mind readers. You're going to tell me what I really meant instead of listening to what I actually said. What you actually said was pretty clear, Whoopi interjected. You said people like us live in a different world and don't understand regular Americans. The subtext isn't exactly subtle. The subtext, Blake's voice cracked with disbelief. I was talking about geographic and cultural differences, not racial ones. But you immediately went there because that's all you know how to do. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and several production assistants had appeared at the edges of the set, clearly unsure of what to do. Whoopi stepped even closer to Blake, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more menacing than her shouting. "Blake, I've been in this business for 40 years. I've seen every kind of coded language there is, so don't stand there and insult my intelligence by pretending your words don't have meaning." "My words have exactly the meaning I give them," Blake replied, matching her intensity. "And I'm not going to let you or anyone else twist them into something they're not." "Then maybe you should choose your words more carefully," Whoopi said. "Or maybe you should listen more carefully," Blake countered. The standoff continued for several more seconds before Alyssa Farah Griffin, who had been silent up until now, tried to break the tension. "I think we're all getting a little heated here," she said nervously. "Maybe we should take a commercial break." "And no," Blake said firmly, never taking his eyes off Whoopi. "I want to finish this conversation. I came here to talk about my music, and somehow it turned into a character assassination. I think the viewers deserve to see how this really works." "How it really works?" Whoopi demanded this. Blake gestured around the table. "This whole setup, you invite someone on. You ask them loaded questions. And then when they don't give you the answers you want, you attack them personally. It's not journalism. It's a hit job." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb. Whoopi's face went through a series of expressions from shock to anger to something that looked almost like hurt. "A hit job?" she repeated slowly. "Blake, we asked you about your public statements. That's not a hit job. That's accountability." "Accountability." Blake laughed harshly. "That's rich coming from someone who's made a career out of saying whatever she wants without consequences." "Without consequences," Whoopi's voice was rising again. "Blake, I've faced consequences for my words my entire career. I've been criticized. I've been canceled. I've been attacked. But I keep speaking my truth because that's what integrity looks like." "Integrity?" Blake's voice was dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call it when you use your platform to silence people who disagree with you?" "I'm not silencing anyone." Whoopi shot back. "You're sitting right here talking. Nobody's stopping you from saying whatever you want to say. Really, because it feels like every time I try to explain my position, you interrupt me or twist my words or accuse me of having hidden meanings." "Maybe that's because your position is indefensible," Whoopi said bluntly. The words hit Blake like a physical blow. He stared at her for a long moment, his jaw working as if he was trying to process what she'd just said. "Indefensible," he repeated quietly. "I believe in hard work and family and community is indefensible." "Your belief in those things is fine," Whoopi said. "It's when you use those beliefs to exclude and marginalize others that it becomes a problem." "I never excluded anyone," Blake said, his voice getting louder again. "I never marginalized anyone." "You're making that up, am I?" Whoopi challenged. "Because your social media posts paint a pretty clear picture of who you think belongs in your version of America." Blake's hands were shaking now. Whether from anger or frustration, it was hard to tell. "My version of America includes everyone who wants to work hard and contribute to their communities. That's not exclusionary. That's common sense. But what about people who can't work hard because they're disabled? What about people who contribute in ways that don't fit your narrow definition? What about people who need help?" "I never said anything about not helping people who need help." Blake protested. "You're putting words in my mouth again." "I'm listening to the words you've already put out there," Whoopi replied. "And they tell a pretty clear story about your values." Blake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You know what? You're right. My values are clear. I believe in personal responsibility. I believe in earning what you get. I believe in respecting the people who built this country. And I believe in taking care of each other." Whoopi said, also standing. "I believe in lifting up the people who've been knocked down. I believe in using our success to help others succeed." "That's not mutually exclusive with what I believe," Blake said. "Isn't it?" Whoopi challenged. "Because your policies and your candidates sure seem to think it is." Blake's face darkened. "My candidates, now you're telling me who I vote for." "I'm looking at who you support publicly," Whoopi said. "And their records speak for themselves. The records are a hell of a lot better than your candidates' records." Blake shot back. The studio erupted. Audience members were gasping. The other co-hosts were trying to speak over each other, and the production crew was in full panic mode. "My candidates," Whoopi's voice was thunderous. "Blake, I don't tell people who to vote for. I tell them to vote, period. But you seem to think anyone who disagrees with your politics is somehow un-American." I never said that, Blake protested. But his voice was lost in the chaos. You didn't have to say it, Whoopi continued. It's in every interview you give, every tweet you send, every time you talk about real Americans versus everyone else. Blake was gesturing wildly now, his Oklahoma accent so thick it was almost hard to understand him. You're twisting everything. I've ever said this is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't just disagree with someone. You have to destroy them. Nobody's trying to destroy you. Blake. Joy. Behar said, trying once again to calm the situation. We're trying to have a conversation. A conversation. Blake turned to Joy with disbelief. Is that what you call this? Because it feels more like a trial. Maybe that's because you're feeling guilty about something, Whoopi said quietly. But her words carried across the studio like a gunshot. Blake froze. For a moment, the entire studio went silent again. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely controlled. Guilty? What exactly should I feel guilty about? Whoopi, you tell me, she replied, crossing her arms. You're the one who seems to be taking everything so personally. Blake stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Then, slowly, he reached up and removed his cowboy hat, running his hand through his hair. You know what? He said finally. You're right. I am taking this personally because you're not just attacking my politics. You're attacking everything I am and everything I come from, and I'm not going to sit here and let you do it. The studio was electric with tension as Blake held his hat in his hands, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. Whoopi stood across from him, her arms still crossed, her eyes never wavering from his face. Nobody's attacking who you are, Blake, she said, her voice softer now, but still firm. But when you use your platform to promote divisive rhetoric, you have to expect pushback. Divisive rhetoric. Blake's voice cracked with emotion. I'm talking about the values my grandfather taught me, the lessons my parents drilled into me. If that's divisive, then I guess I'm guilty as charged. Your grandfather's values don't have to be everyone's values, Whoopi replied. And they don't have to be the only values that matter in America. Blake shook his head slowly, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. There it is. You just proved my point. My grandfather's values, the values that built this country, they don't matter anymore. They're just relics of a bygone era that enlightened people like you need to sweep away. That's not what I said, Whoopi protested. It's exactly what you said, Blake shot back. You just said my grandfather's values don't have to be the only values that matter. But here's the thing, Whoopi. They used to matter. They used to be respected. Now they're treated like something to be ashamed of. The other co-hosts were watching this exchange like spectators at a tennis match, their heads turning back and forth between Blake and Whoopi. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Blake, Sunny host said carefully. Think what Whoopi is trying to say is that we can honor traditional values while also embracing progress and inclusion. Blake turned to Sunny, his eyes blazing. Progress. Is that what you call it when you teach children that their country is fundamentally evil? When you tell them that their ancestors were monsters? When you make them feel guilty for being born who they are? Nobody's teaching children that. Joy Behar interjected. Aren't they? Blake challenged. Because that's sure what it looks like from where I'm sitting. Every day there's a new story about some school or some company telling people they need to feel bad about their heritage, their culture, their very existence. Whoopi stepped forward, her voice rising again. Blake teaching the full history of this country, including the parts that are uncomfortable, isn't the same as teaching children to hate themselves. Full history? Blake laughed bitterly. Mean the version of history that focuses exclusively on everything America got wrong and ignores everything it got right. The version that paints the Founding Fathers as nothing but slave owners and the pioneers as nothing but genocidal killers. The Founding Fathers were slave owners, Whoopi said bluntly. That's not opinion, that's fact. Some of them were, Blake acknowledged. But they were also brilliant men who created the framework for the freest, most prosperous nation in human history. They were flawed human beings who did something extraordinary. But all you want to talk about are the flaws. Because those flaws affected real people, Whoopi said, her voice passionate. They affected my ancestors. They affected millions of people who were bought and sold like property. You can't just ignore that because it makes you uncomfortable. Blake's face was red again, but this time it looked more like hurt than anger. I'm not ignoring it. I'm not asking anyone to ignore it. But I'm also not going to stand here and let you reduce the entire American experiment to nothing but slavery and oppression. Nobody's reducing it to nothing but that. Alyssa Farah Griffin said, trying to find middle ground. But we can't ignore those parts of our history either. Can't we talk about both? Blake asked, his voice plaintive now. Can't we acknowledge the mistakes while also celebrating the achievements? Can't we honor the people who built this country while also working to fix the problems they left behind? We can, Whoopi said, but not if we pretend those problems don't exist or that they're not still affecting people today. Blake ran his hand through his hair again, his frustration evident. I never said they don't exist. I never said they're not affecting people. But when you spend all your time focusing on the problems and none of your time celebrating the progress, you create a generation of people who hate their own country. Or maybe, Whoopi said pointedly, you create a generation of people who love their country enough to want to make it better. Better for who? Blake asked. Because it seems like your version of better means tearing down everything that came before, regardless of whether it was good or bad. The question hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed like the conversation might take a more constructive turn. But then Whoopi shook her head. Blake, I'm not trying to tear down everything that came before. I'm trying to build something that includes everyone, not just the people who've always been included. And I'm trying to preserve the values that made inclusion possible in the first place, Blake replied. The values of hard work, personal responsibility, and respect for others. Those values are fine, Whoopi said, but they're not exclusively conservative values. And they're not exclusively white values. And they're not exclusively rural values. People in cities work hard. People of all colors take personal responsibility. People from all backgrounds respect. Others, Blake's jaw tightened. I never said they were exclusively anything. You're putting words in my mouth again. Am I? Whoopi challenged. Because when you talk about real Americans and traditional values, you're not talking about everyone. You're talking about people who look like you and think like you and live like you. That's not true, Blake said. But his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Whoopi pressed. When you picture a real American, what do you see? When you think about traditional values, whose traditions are you thinking about? Blake stared at her, his mouth opening and closing as if he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. That's what I thought, Whoopi said quietly. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The cameras continued to roll. Every moment of Blake's internal struggle. Finally, he put his hat back on his head and looked directly at Whoopi. You want to know what I see when I picture a real American? He said, his voice steady now. I see someone who gets up every morning and tries to make their life and their community a little bit better. I see someone who takes care of their family and helps their neighbors. I see someone who believes in something bigger than themselves. That's beautiful, Blake, Whoopi said, and for a moment her voice was softer. But that describes a lot of people you seem to think aren't real Americans. Blake's composure cracked again. I never said anyone wasn't a real American. Never. You keep putting those words in my mouth, but I never said them. You didn't have to say them, Whoopi replied. Your politics say them for you. My politics. Blake's voice was incredulous. My politics are about giving people the freedom to succeed or fail on their own merits. About getting government out of the way so people can build the lives they want. And what about the people who can't build the lives they want because the system is rigged against them? Whoopi asked. What about the people who work just as hard as anyone else but can't get ahead because they didn't start with the same advantages? Blake threw his hands up in exasperation. Then we fix the system, but we don't tear down the whole country to do it. Nobody's trying to tear down the whole country, Whoopi said, her voice rising again. We're trying to make it work for everyone, not just the people who've always had it easy. Had it easy? Blake's voice was tight with emotion. You think I've had it easy? You think everyone who agrees with me has had it easy? Let me tell you something about easy, Whoopi. Easy isn't working 3 jobs to pay for college. Easy isn't watching your parents lose their farm because of government regulations. Easy isn't being told that your values and your way of life are outdated and problematic. And easy isn't being told you don't belong in your own country. Whoopi shot back. Easy isn't having to prove your worth every single day because of the color of your skin. Easy isn't watching your children get treated differently because of where they come from. The two stood there, breathing heavily, staring at each other across a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. The studio was completely silent, except for the hum of the cameras and the air conditioning. Finally, Blake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You know what? You're right. We see different Americas. We always have, and we probably always will. But the difference is I still believe we can find common ground. You seem to think that's impossible. Common ground requires both sides to be willing to compromise. Whoopi said. It requires both sides to acknowledge that they might be wrong about something. Blake stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. You're absolutely right, and I'm waiting for you to acknowledge that you might be wrong about me. The challenge hung in the air between them. Whoopi's face went through a series of expressions before settling into something that looked almost like resignation. Maybe I am wrong about you, Blake, she said finally. But I'm not wrong about the harm that some of your positions cause to real people. And maybe I'm wrong about some things too, Blake replied. But I'm not wrong about the importance of the values I was raised with. For a brief moment, it looked like they might actually find that common ground Blake had mentioned. But then a voice from the audience shouted, "Just agree to disagree already." The interruption broke the spell. Both Blake and Whoopi turned toward the audience, suddenly remembering that they were on television, that this entire confrontation was being broadcast to millions of people. Blake looked around the studio, taking in the faces of the crew members, the other co-hosts, the audience members who were staring at him with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but firm. You know what? I think I've said everything I came here to say, and probably a lot more than I should have. He stood up and straightened his jacket, then looked directly at Whoopi. Thank you for the conversation, Whoopi. It wasn't what I expected, but it was definitely enlightening. Whoopi nodded slowly. Thank you for being willing to have it, Blake. Even if we don't agree, Blake started to walk toward the edge of the set, then stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you care about people, and I respect that. I just wish you could see that I care about people, too, even if I show it differently. I can see that, Whoopi said quietly. I really can. Blake nodded once, then walked off the set without another word. The cameras followed him until he disappeared behind the curtain, leaving the co-hosts sitting in stunned silence. As the credits began to roll, Whoopi looked directly into the camera. We'll be right back after these messages. But everyone in that studio knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Was Blake right to stand his ground, or did Whoopi make the better points? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more explosive celebrity stories that you won't find anywhere.